It's a good thing that we're blessed with natural resources. Imagine if we were like Japan or something. I mean, we couldn't even survive if we were in their situation. So it's a good thing we've got those things. But, I think if you actually think about it and you look at the relationship that America has with China, and you just, look at what we sell them and what they sell us. And if you didn't know anything, if you were just like on another planet and you said, hey, here's these two countries, one of them grows shit and takes stuff out of the ground, raw materials, and sends it to this other country, which sends back all these manufactured finished goods and stuff like that. China would look like the real economic power. We're like a little colony of China. I mean, we're sending them stuff that grows, and they're making all the stuff that, where you need factories. So they've got all the economic industrial might. All we got is a bunch of farmers. Not to belittle them, but that's just harvesting, what we've got from God. We don't have the industrial might that we once had, because you look at what America's exports were 50, 60, 70 years ago. We were exporting manufactured goods. That dwarfed our agriculture. That's what we were giving everybody. Automobiles, refrigerators, washer dryers, television sets, cameras, all the stuff, all the quality stuff was all made here. Nobody would buy anything made in Japan, right? It was a joke. So it just shows you how much everything has switched when you just look at the terms of trade and what we produce and sell and what we have to import.
So I think that our global reserve status will change. I think there will be a transition period. The US dollar will not stay the global reserve currency forever. I don't think it will be due to anything that China does. I think it will be more due to just the general, as Peter has very eloquently said, the amount of debt and the amount of the way this whole system is screwed up, I think will necessitate a change in the system and a transition to the system. And on the other side of that transition, the dollar probably falls in value, loses its status. I think that could take a lot longer than most other people, but I do think that will eventually happen. But what I don't think will happen is I do not think that there will be a transition and we end up with another system where in that transition period, the dollar does not go higher. I don't think that we can go to a new system where the dollar is no longer the global reserve currency, where in that interim, the dollar did not go dramatically higher.
That's a key point of disagreement because I don't think the dollar loses its status because of its strength. I think it's the weakness of the dollar that ultimately undoes its status. I mean, as long as the dollar is sound, I think it can continue. I think what happens with all the debt is the world recognizes that it's unpayable and that the United States is insolvent. We keep reminding the world that we're insolvent every time we go through one of these, charades with the debt ceiling. What does the Secretary of the Treasury, what does the Federal Reserve Chairman, what does the President say is going to happen if we don't raise the debt? They say, well, we're going to default. If we don't raise the debt, we default on U.S. Treasuries. So that's an admission that we're running this gigantic Ponzi scheme and that default is eventually inevitable because nobody is saying, well, if we can't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to cut Social Security. We're going to cut Medicare. We're going to raise taxes because we're going to pay our bills. We're going to pay the interest on the debt. We're going to pay the principal. No, they're saying if we can't borrow more money from the rest of the world, well, then we're not going to pay back any of the money that we've already borrowed. So it's like we're running a Ponzi scheme. And so if the world eventually says, we don't want to participate in a Ponzi scheme anymore because we know how Ponzi schemes end, the one ceiling that we can't raise is the lending ceiling. See, the debt ceiling is self-imposed. We can keep raising it because that's how much money we want to borrow. But the ceiling that we can't raise is how much money the world wants to lend. And when America's creditors are no mas, we don't want to loan you any more money because you can't possibly pay us back the money we've already loaned you. We're done throwing good money after bad. That's when everything collapses. And that's with dollar weakness, not strength.
I would concede Peter's point. This someday will happen. But the point I would very much like to make is everything that Peter is talking about happening to the dollar one day in the future is already happening right now today in Japan and Europe. Nobody, when there's a Japanese government bond auction, the Japanese or the BOJ is the biggest buyer. No foreigners are running over there and buying trillions of dollars worth of Japanese government bonds. The ECB is currently monetizing almost all of the debt of the periphery countries. Even though they're raising rates, they're doing QE at the same time. Meanwhile, over the last month, every time the Treasury has had Treasury auctions, there has been a record number of foreigners, indirect bidders, showing up to buy the Treasuries. So the point Peter makes is good. There will come a point where this happens, and that's why I think eventually, the dollar, days will be numbered. But all of the worries that people associate with the dollar are already happening right now today to its competitor currencies. And so on a relative basis, I think the US and the US dollar are actually sitting in pretty good position.
Well, I think we're only in a good position because of the perception and the dollar's role as the reserve currency. It's like whenever there's a problem in the world, people buy dollars, even if that problem is in the United States. And I think that the best example of the absurdity of this, if you recall, the only time that a rating agency downgraded U.S. Treasury, and they went from AAA or wherever it was to AA or whatever they did. The stock market didn't like that. But when that happened, there was this so-called flight to quality, and people bought U.S. Treasuries on the downgrade of U.S. Treasuries. So, I mean, how can that be? That doesn't make any sense. So that shows you that we even benefit from our own problems because it causes people to want to loan us even more money so we can make those problems even worse. This system should have unraveled a long time ago. The fact that it hasn't means that the economy of the United States is just that much more screwed up than it was, years or decades past. And so you're right, eventually it ends, but the sooner the better. From the perspective of the longer it takes, the worse it's going to be. Holding U.S. Treasuries and using dollars are two very different things. I mean, there's nothing that stops the Chinese from getting rid of their treasuries, but transacting in dollars. They just don't want to hold on to them. They don't want to buy treasuries with them. They want to just use them to buy stuff, buy real things instead of treasuries. And of course, that is very inflationary here in the United States because if the Chinese want to buy real stuff with their dollars instead of treasuries, it's treasury prices that will fall and the price of everything that they are buying, that's going to go up. And of course, a lot of this stuff is stuff that Americans want to buy. So we'll start to see much higher prices. But my point I'm making is, yes, even if the Federal Reserve can quickly monetize all the debt that the Chinese no longer own, and we take the hit to inflation, because if you print all that money, prices are going to go up and the dollar is going to go down. But it's more of the message that it sends going forward. Well, China's not there anymore. China's not going to be buying any more treasuries. And, what are they going to buy? What are the Chinese going to buy with all the dollars that they get when they unload their treasuries? My guess would be they'd buy a lot of gold, and so that would push up the price of gold, and that hurts the dollar because, gold is kind of a barometer of confidence in the dollar. And you start to really see gold going up, that makes people question the dollar and think, well, maybe we should have gold instead of the dollar. The Biden administration is thinking of imposing more sanctions on Americans, and they say, it's sanctions. They want to say it's sanction China and say Americans can't invest in China. The sanctions aren't on China. The sanctions are on Americans. They're taking away the freedom of Americans to invest their money where they want to invest. And the worst thing is when the U.S. government forces an American to divest of an investment he already owns, because then he might end up having to get out at a fire sale price. So all of these actions that the government might take, they're all against American citizens. They're never against China. They're all undermining the individual liberties and freedoms of Americans, and they make American poor. Some other investors might get a break because now they get to buy the assets that we have to sell at a fire sale price. But if the Biden administration actually says, we're not going to let Americans invest in Chinese companies, well, that might be the first salvo in that war. How would I respond if I was China? We're not going to invest in your bonds, because that's what they invest in now. They buy our bonds. Okay, Americans, you can't buy Chinese businesses. Fine, we're not lending you any more money.